Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. I'm Jody Schwartz from New York, Vice Chair of the JFNA Board. Welcome to the session, A Crisis Like We've Never Seen, Leading Organizations from Radical Uncertainty. Thank you so much for joining us today. Recordings of this session and all other workshops will be available online after the GA ends. I hope you're also planning to join us this afternoon at 1:30 for the Jewish Together plenary. It is trite to say that we find ourselves with significant responsibility, trying to lead through this unprecedented situation. Still, it is the context for our work together now. We have so much on our shoulders, and we are finding our way through together. How do we find our way through? Fortunately, we can learn from experts on crisis leadership, namely Professor Dutch Leonard, who has appointments at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and Harvard's Business School. Professor Leonard will draw from his work to share with us skills that are needed to lead through the situations we can't understand or even predict, where we can't know the outcomes and where we constantly need to integrate, innovate, and iterate on the fly. I'm pleased also to welcome Rabbi Jay Moses, Vice President of the Wexner Foundation, who will open our conversation with comments on the importance of strong and intentional Jewish communal leadership during this time. At a few times during the session, Dutch will ask us to share reflections via chat, but please feel free to chat at any time. Also share questions, of course, through the Q&A channel, and I'll stop Dutch a few times to ask questions. Rabbi Moses, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jody. In 1918, the influx of 3 million Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe was nearly complete. Neighborhoods like the Lower East Side of New York were teeming with Jewish life. In Jewish communities around North America, the focus for both the immigrants and the established community leaders who welcomed them was acculturating and Americanizing as quickly as possible while providing for all the needs of Jewish life. This was the world in which our current federation system was born. We know that the seeds of our robust communal infrastructure were being planted during those days. We can scarcely imagine what it must have been like to add a pandemic to the hardscrabble immigrant lives our great-grandparents were living in 1918. In my hometown, Detroit Jewish News, the guidance exactly 102 years ago today was timeless. Wash your hands, avoid crowds, get fresh air, and perhaps most important of all, keep calm and don't panic. It's no surprise to us. We do know one thing: Jews are good in a crisis. We emerged from the Spanish flu pandemic and within a few decades built a community that is a shining jewel of achievement, generosity, and goodness. For most of the past 75 years, though, the crises have been about Jews elsewhere, supporting Israel in its various conflicts, freeing Soviet Jewry, and caring for hungry and vulnerable Jews around the world. Closer to home, if it can be said that we have been managing a crisis as stakeholders in federations and agencies, it has been one born of our prosperity and comfort. But today, we are faced with a situation that hits us in all of our most vulnerable places. First, of course, for some of us, COVID-19 has brought very personal struggles with illness, loss, and grief. With an aging population, we have been hit as hard as the community at large. Our prayers for strength and healing go out to each of you who have suffered or lost a loved one. Second, the economy that has undergirded our prosperity as a community is teetering and will in all likelihood hit us even harder in 5781. And third, the leadership of our community was not adequately prepared for a situation like a pandemic. This is partly because of our understandable tendency to focus on the daily challenges that are actually before us, rather than the once-in-a-century crises that may or may not befall us. But it also revealed some deeper issues: our tendency to rest on the laurels of our success, our resistance to collaboration and change, an infrastructure that is overbuilt and not as lean and efficient as it could be. Before the pandemic, we were already seeing radical changes in the way our community is constituted and the way it does business. Financial and membership models were under strain. Legacy organizations with overlapping missions were clinging to their identities in the face of pressure to adapt, collaborate, merge, or sunset. All of this was happening in slow motion on the scale of generational time. COVID-19 will speed this entire process up, and what was unfolding over decades will now be forced upon us in just a few years. All of this comes at a time when our community has suffered job losses, childcare crises, and educational uncertainty no different from that of our neighbors. The needs that our agencies and synagogues are compelled to address are growing at the same moment that their resources are shrinking. It's a perfect storm. Despite that bleak backdrop, though, there is much cause for hope. I see it every day in my work at the Wexner Foundation, where we train and inspire leaders to adapt to constantly changing conditions. Our alumni, including the wonderful Jody Schwartz, who introduced this session, and many of you on this call, are a force for the collaborative and adaptive leadership that such a crisis requires. I see it in the work that so many of you are doing in our federations and agencies to raise critical funds to care for those hardest hit by COVID. I see it in my own children's experience at Columbus Jewish Day School. At a school assembly during the recent Chagim, their smiles were covered by masks and their voices were constrained from singing. But as they danced, acted, and celebrated in COVID-safe protocols, the wise and creative spirit of Jewish life filled in every crack in the pandemic's facade. And in addition to the great spirit of resilience that our people has displayed for millennia, we have a secret weapon, Professor Dutch Leonard. Dutch has spent decades honing ideas that have strengthened and inspired leaders to confront some of the world's greatest challenges. Dutch has taught Wexner Israel Fellows for many years at Harvard's Kennedy School, and we are honored to have him here today to share his critical insights on crisis management. We know his teaching will benefit us all as we guide our communities through these not completely unprecedented, but still radically challenging times. Dutch, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Moses. That was a wonderful setting of the table for our discussion today. And thank you, Jody and Beth and others who helped to make this possible and for us all to be here today. It's a real privilege for me to have a chance to talk to you all. I hope that the General Assembly is going well for you. That I dropped in on a couple of sessions yesterday and found it very engaging. So first, thank you for being here. Thank all of you for making this possible. First thing I want to say is shalom. And I also want to say Shana Tova. I know I'm late. I mean, like really late, but this is my only chance. So I wanted to say Shana Tova to you because I really am hoping, along with all of you, that God will send us a better year in 5781. This has been a really tough period, but yours is a community. Just saying 5781 reminds us of how long this community has been engaged. So you've seen a lot of times come and go, good and bad. You know that there are bad years, really terrible bad years, and often they come in bunches. So let us all hope for a real change and an ability to move forward. But I think we've still got a ways to go, and that's part of what we want to talk about in our discussion today. So a couple of things as we get started. Chat is open, so please use chat. Please stay on point. Please chat to everyone. But I'm going to ask you some questions as we go along, and chat's a really good way to answer those because everybody gets to see your thoughts. And so I'm looking for as much of an interactive discussion as we can have. We can also use the Q&A, and Jody's going to help me to monitor that. So Jody, if you see anything in that and I'm rolling on, you should feel free to stop me, and we'll turn to questions as they come up. But what I want to begin with, so first of all, I thought it might be nice for you all to begin where we'd all love to be, which is in a classroom. The virtual background that is behind me here is my classroom at the Harvard Business School. And what's on the board is actually a class on crisis management. So I thought we might actually start there. But what I'm going to do is actually show some slides with you, or some notes on what I'm describing, which will appear in my background as this one is now. So if you put yourself on speaker rather than gallery, you will probably be able to see those a little bit better as we go along. So this session is about crisis management, and we're going to spend some time talking here about crisis management issues. But in a larger sense, this session really isn't about crisis management. It's really about the application of crisis management thinking, the kinds of skills that we've been using in crisis management, for the more general problem of innovation. And I want to start there, and we'll come back to that at the end. Most of what we're going to do is going to focus more or less on crisis issues. But I want to start with this idea that what we are really doing is thinking about innovation. So here's the thought. Leadership, in my view, is all about innovation. When you are doing things, and tomorrow is going to be pretty much like today, you don't actually need leadership. What you need is management, which is an extremely important thing. So I don't mean to denigrate management by saying it's not about innovation. Management is mostly, it's about small scale innovation, but management is mostly about our ability to keep doing the things that we already know how to do and to do them really well. Leadership is about when we're making significant changes, which is what we want to do now in the midst of a crisis like COVID, and also in some of the challenges that are going to come after COVID. So I want to think of leadership with you as about things that you do, and it's about innovating. It's about coming up with and trying out and developing and then installing new ideas and new approaches. So I like to think about it this way. So leadership is about innovation. In my view, crisis management is an instance of innovation. That is, it's just an example of when we need to innovate. And the reason is because we're facing something we haven't seen before, and that in effect requires innovation. So what we're really working on here is what I would describe as the unified field theory of leadership, innovation, and crisis management. We're going to see how those things are related to one another. Now, to do that, I want to ask you to look at my favorite picture here. I'm going to step out of the way for a second so you can look at this a little bit more closely. My favorite picture is, I call it the fundamental classification problem. And the point is this: the first thing we ought to do when we're looking at a situation is to ask, what kind of problem do we have today? Or what kind of challenge or what kind of opportunity? Where is it in this picture? And depending on that, we should bring different toolkits to the situation, to what we're doing. So on the horizontal axis here, what we have is the degree of uncertainty. And I'm using Donald Rumsfeld's famous tripartite division. Known knowns, that is fairly predictable, low uncertainty. Known unknowns, we know what the issues are, although we don't know how they're going to turn out. So we know weather is important, but we don't know what the weather is going to be. And then to the right-hand side, unknown unknowns, we don't even know what the issues are going to be. I think it would not be lost on any of you to know that we've all been in kind of to the right side of this recently, that COVID pushed us in that direction. But what I want to do is observe with you so how we might think about the relationship between these two things. Oh, sorry, I didn't say what the vertical axis is. The vertical axis is the likelihood that we will have to make significant changes while we're already underway. So we're ongoing in our project. What's the likelihood that we're going to have to make significant changes, the probability of significant change while underway? This is the proverbial having to fix the plane while flying it, or even build the plane while flying it. So what does this curve look like? I submit to you it looks something like this: that if we're going into largely known circumstances, predictable circumstances, the likelihood of major changes in the plans and the way we're going to operate is relatively low. As we go through the zone of known unknowns, the probability of the uncertainty rises, and the probability that we'll have to make major changes also rises pretty quickly. And as we get into the zone of unknown unknowns, the likelihood that we'll have to make significant changes in the way we're operating is approximately 1. So what I want to do is ask you to push your thinking away from the middle of this picture. Because when I go around and ask organizations where they are in this picture, almost all of them say the same thing. Oh, well, we have some uncertainties, but we know most of what those uncertainties are. We're just not exactly sure how they're going to turn out. So if I'm a real estate developer, I know interest rates are important and they're variable, and I don't know exactly what they're going to be, but I have some estimates. That would be a problem that's sort of in the middle. The reason I want to push your thinking away from the middle is that when we give that answer, it begins to look to us like all problems are very similar to each other. And so the result of that is that we pay attention to them and we use the same toolkit for all of them. And we think, well, some are a little more uncertain, some a little less uncertain, but to a first approximation, they're all sort of middle ground problems. I want to argue instead that there are two different kinds of problems. Most organizations, I think of all their problems as more or less the same with a little bit of variability in terms of how much uncertainty there is. That means that they mostly exercise one toolkit. They use one approach. I want to do a really heavy leadership and organizational lift here. I want to go all the way from having one to having two organizational routines. I want to distinguish two types of problems. First, I want to look at problems which are business as usual. Low uncertainty, a high degree of understanding about what's going to happen, and already pretty well developed approach for how to do it. Therefore, the probability that we're going to have to make changes relatively low. And I want to distinguish that area from the upper right-hand side of this picture, going into the unknown, and think about the different toolkit. And if you can see where this is going, COVID-19 has been training us all in how to operate in the upper right-hand side. Whereas most of our activity, most of the time, is on the lower left-hand side. And I don't mean by making this distinction to say that one of these is right and the other's wrong, or one's good and the other's bad. They're both really important, but they're different. And if we understood the difference and brought our best selves to each of these two problems, we would bring different tools. So let me ask you about that. And I promise you we'll come to COVID in a moment and to dealing with the crisis that we've all been in and will be in for a while. But let me ask you for a moment to just chat in a few words. What is the toolkit that we use in the lower left-hand side, the business as usual side, the low uncertainty, low probability of change? What do I mean by a toolkit? Well, an example of a tool is a budget, a really detailed budget that tells us exactly what resources we have. Because in the lower left-hand side, we can do that, right? We can easily figure out what the budget's going to be. We can produce a plan, a financial plan in the form of a budget that's going to guide us. Okay, so I'm starting to get some great answers. 3-year business plan. We can write a 3-year business plan because we can predict. Strategic plans, logic models, historical strategic plan, consensus, everybody's on the same play, using templates, meetings to get everybody into alignment. What makes this side different, though, from the more uncertain circumstances? What other kinds of tools do you use? For example, think about what sorts of targets do you have? What kinds of measurement do you do? What kinds of systems or procedures do you use? Okay, so we are collaborating with the usual partners. I'm reading some of these things. You all should read these as well as they go by, because we all get the same ability to see what everybody's thinking about. We can list the tasks for business as usual. They're easily identifiable. We can tell what they are. They're clearly specified. We know what to do. Ellen says we have data collection. We can collect data. We know what data to collect, and we know what to study and how to think about it. So what we are doing on this lower left-hand side, think about what your answers are saying here. What we're doing is we're optimizing. We have a very high degree of understanding of what's going on. We have standard operating procedures. We have metrics. We have targets. By the way, another thing that goes in this zone, accountability. We hold people accountable for being able to hit their targets. We have a set of metrics and we think, you should be able to do this. And if you can't, there's something wrong. So the left-hand side is all about optimization and applying what we already know. It's often in the literature, this is called the exploit zone. That may seem like an odd term, but what it means is we are exploiting knowledge that we already have. Whereas in the upper right-hand side, our performance will be dominated by things that we do not yet know, that we'll have to figure out. So that's the distinction. Fundamentally, we know what we're doing and we're improving it, we're tinkering with it on the lower left-hand side. And on the upper right-hand side, we are being challenged by a situation that we don't fully understand. And so we're gonna have to use a whole different set of tools and techniques. A colleague of ours in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, he's a computer scientist, wrote a paper a long time ago, and some friends of his read the paper and said, oh, I know what the title of this should have been. And so he's now written a book with the title that they suggested. As a result of reading that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, but as a result of reading it, I would now characterize the lower left-hand side of this picture as what we are trying to do is to get things perfectly, exactly correct. We're treating this as if it were a mechanism that like a Swiss watch that we can get just right and we can have it ticking along just the way we hope and it's going to keep perfect time. That's kind of our left-hand side mentality. And so let's think a little bit about the right-hand side. What's the right-hand side look like? The right-hand side is the higher uncertainty zone. Unknown unknowns. We're not even sure what the issues are that we're going to deal with. So the probability there that we're going to have to make significant alterations as we go along is one. For sure we're going to have to. So let me ask you this. What's the toolkit in this domain? What are the things that we do? What are the approaches or procedures? Imagination, experimentation. Oh, these are great answers. Scenario planning, we can think of different things. Tears, yes, that's so true because it's frustrating. Flexibility, lower barriers, creativity. Oh, this is great. Faith helps us to keep going on the hope that we can continue to improve. Prayer study. Oh, I love these answers. This is great. Pivot, pilot, and pivot. Okay, so we're reimagining things. We're changing priorities. A word for all of this is that we are learning rapidly, we are adapting, and we are experimenting. So there is, by the way, a toolkit for doing that. It's called the Agile process, design thinking. It flies under many flags. But the fact is there are tools. Now, notice how different that is. Notice how different the tools of imagination and brainstorming and experimentation are from the tools on the lower left-hand side, which are stay with the knitting and make sure we're doing this right, and let's have accountability and check on what's going on, and so forth and so on. So that is a fundamentally different circumstance, and that's the main point I wanted to observe, is that we should think of these as more differentiated rather than allow our thinking to be mushed in the middle. Now, of course, most problems are sort of in the middle. They have some known unknowns. We have pretty good techniques for being able to deal with risk management and assessments, and scenario planning actually works in the middle as well. But those techniques form a kind of complex that works sort of from the middle of this diagram and over toward the left. It doesn't work so well over toward the right. So the issue is, are we mostly on the left-hand side, where we basically know what we're doing, know what the issues are, and mainly need to execute? So I often call the lower left-hand side the anticipate, plan, execute paradigm, because first you anticipate, then you plan meticulously, then you execute precisely, and we get great results. We get highly efficient, really terrific outcomes. And by the way, much of our human existence and much of our status in life is as positive as it is because we've learned a lot about how to do that, because business as usual works really, really well. So what we observe is it's a completely different story if you're on the right-hand side. And a thing I would just observe with you, and I'll leave you to think about this, or we can talk about it later if you want to raise it. But I think there are tremendous biases in most organizations toward left-hand side thinking, toward thinking that progress lies in the direction of doing things in more detail, of getting more meticulous planning, of being more precise in execution, of applying of what we know and staying in compliance with our existing rules and standard operating procedures. And there are a lot of things which are improved that way, to be sure. There are a lot of things which we do very well that way. But the problem with biases are that we think that way, whether it's true or not. And I don't think we think often enough about the right-hand side, about the possibility that we need to rethink something in a more serious and a more differentiated way. Now, obviously, what COVID-19 has done has been to push us all into the zone of the upper right-hand side. Without doubt, that's where we've all, in effect, been living. And so the challenge that we have been facing is to try to figure out how to apply that left-hand side or the right-hand side toolkit. But now the issue is, what might we learn from the way we've done that? And I'm going to turn to that at this point to begin to focus on the COVID lessons. But here's my point to you. Coming out of COVID, first of all, we've still got a lot more COVID to do. There are going to be additional surprises in this domain. Second, after COVID is solved as a medical problem, the aftermath of all the economic and social and other disruption is still going to give us a lot of new challenging problems and opportunities to work with. And then finally, I think the world is accelerating so that the opportunity for additional innovation is still going to be out there, even after COVID is, thankfully, far in the rearview mirror. All right, let's turn to COVID itself and think a little bit about that.
Dutch, do you want to take questions yet, or you want?
Are there some questions that we should take now, Jody? I'm happy to do that.
Somebody is asking about Ralph Stacey's matrix of complexity management and whether it's out of favor or not.
I don't know that I know that one specifically. The idea of complexity is a really important idea. And it is very much a right-hand, it embraces the idea that we are sometimes on the right-hand side. And so chaos theory is what originally began to push people's thinking about. That was happening when I was in graduate school. Complexity theory came along after that. The observation about chaos theory was that when you combine several different things that are all interacting with each other, you often get chaotic rather than highly predictable or perfectly predictable phenomena. And so the whole idea is that the idea of perfect prediction fails. And so, and the people who are researching on this were basically observing there are more situations in the universe that are chaotic than ones that are completely stable. And yet that the left-hand side bias is that we imagine that the ordinary state of the world is stability, when in fact, the ordinary state of nature and of many other phenomena is actually more to the right-hand side. So that would argue for, and to that extent, complexity theory is still a very prevalent and important idea, and still something that we're working with. All right, let me say a few things about COVID and about how we think about crisis management. And you can, as we go along here, you can look at how your own experience over the last 7-8 months has mirrored the kinds of things that I'm describing. So obviously COVID is itself a medical issue, but the crisis that we've all had has been the compounding of the medical challenges with a whole series of economic and social and other disruptions. So it's a much more complicated situation than that. How do we understand this event? That is, say, how do we understand what I call this the task environment. What does the task environment look like? And how's that different from our more ordinary circumstances? So let me ask you this again in the chat. What are some of the ways in which this event, the COVID-19 event, has been different for you than other major events that you've lived through? Probably, hopefully, none of us have lived through something quite as big and global as in a disruption this way. But what are some of the ways in which it's different? A high degree of uncertainty. I love the acronym VUCA. Thank you for that, Jill. VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, chaotic, and ambiguous. I like both complex and chaotic in that. I spell VUCA with 2 C's. Too many unknowns. The fact that we even had food insecurity in places we never would have anticipated having that. It's longer term and it's uncertain duration. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't know when we are finally going to get a vaccine and begin to work our way out of the woods. Interesting. Poor leadership in many domains that we should have been able to do better at this. And so we have all been plunged into uncertainty by the fact that additional uncertainty by the fact that the system was not responding as effectively as it should have been. Politicization, the fact that it was politicized as a crisis, which didn't help any of us. It basically significantly reduced our actual uncertain science about it. Well, that's actually uncertain science is not an unusual feature of a circumstance that's new. It takes a while to figure it out. So yes, widespread suffering associated with this. By the way, also not to be missed, widely differential experiences in different communities. So this has exacerbated a lot of the inequalities that already existed, which is partly why we had an upswelling of demands for social justice, triggered by some specific police actions and so on. But there was an undercurrent already of inequity. And those were lightning rods that caught a lot of that voltage that was already running through the community. So look, that's just have a look. You can all see it as well as I can. This is the task environment that we've been in. It's extremely uncertain. It's a high degree of uncertainty about both what we should be trying to accomplish specifically. We know the general goals, but what does that translate into in terms of what we should be doing immediately, setting priorities and so on. So the challenge for this kind of circumstance, and we like to say this as a general matter, I think of any major emergency as a volcano of issues and questions and conflicts in priority. But in most cases, in what we call routine situations, like an earthquake, for example, which is a horrible event. So routine emergency here doesn't mean good or easy or small. What it means is something that we've seen multiple times before. So it's horrible for the people who are in it, but at least we're familiar with it and we know basically what to do. So in routine situations, all of those things, all of the things, the issues, the competing priorities, the questions, all of these are familiar to us. But in COVID-19, all of this was new. Virtually nothing was known. And as you observed, there was uncertain science and changes. People changed their minds as they went along. Well, they changed their minds because they learned as they went along that the situation was different than they had thought. That's what they're supposed to do, by the way. That's what science is. It's the process of trying to learn as we go. But it's unsettling because what it tells us is that we don't already know. So that's the circumstance that we've been in COVID-19. Let me offer you this as a picture of in ordinary times, the level of challenge to our organizations may be rising over time, but our expertise is also rising. We're figuring it out. We're finding people who know more. We're figuring out what we need to know. This is all left-hand side, by the way. We're improving our procedures. We're developing more expertise at the specific things that we're working on. And as long as the challenge doesn't move too fast, we're able to kind of keep up. And I think in general terms, we often feel like there's a diminishing gap. You know, we're getting better and better at dealing with whatever it is. Okay, what did COVID do? COVID is a sudden radical shift in this. Suddenly the challenges are different than we've seen before, higher, but also different. And what that does is it immediately obsolesces a whole bunch of our expertise. A lot of things that we already know how to do, you can't do anymore. They don't fit in the current environment. So in that circumstance, our expertise, the expertise that we've accumulated, a lifetime of learning about how to operate in the non-COVID environment, much of that is suddenly not relevant because it doesn't fit in the COVID environment. And you don't even know, you got to figure that out as well. So suddenly we have this enormous gap, this vacuum, and that's kind of how it feels. It's like, oh my God, what do we do? Well, we're going to have to try to get on top of this as quickly as we can. And that process has certain characteristics, which we've all been living through. So crisis situations confront us with a very unsettling question. The question is, what do we do when no one knows what to do? We're used to spending most of our life on the lower left-hand side. And we often turn to people who are experts, authority figures, other people who are supposed to know. And we say, what are we supposed to do? And they know, they can give you an answer. That's a left-hand side circumstance. And we're comfortable with that. We don't always love turning to authority, but nonetheless, we feel like, you know, most authorities actually know something about what they're trying to help us to do. So we're used to having a place to turn to get guidance about what we should do. In non-routine emergency situations, in crisis situations like COVID, we have a different problem. What do we do when nobody knows what to do? There's nobody around. There are lots of people around who are experts in different aspects of what we're doing, but there's nobody who's got the comprehensive story. Well, the answer is we have to figure it out in real time. So crisis leadership, this is a definition we've often used. Crisis leadership is constituted by rapid innovation under stress because of all the things that you said in the chat about what the circumstances are, this task environment, very high stakes, very high uncertainty. It's scary. So rapid innovation under stress, embedded in fear. Most people and most organizations are not very good at that unless they practice it, unless we support each other in the process, unless we understand this is the normal circumstance right now. This is our current normal, our calling in life, our conditions of service are characterized by this. And so we may not be familiar with it, but it's what we actually have to do. So what I would emphasize to you is that the appropriate answer to every question that you have about COVID-19 is a process. In other words, what we say, when somebody asks you, what are we going to do about this? What you answer is not your best guess of what we should do, but instead, here's the process we are going to use for figuring out what to do. So the best approach when any major question arises in this kind of circumstance, COVID-19 or any other surprising and novel circumstance, is to answer, well, this is the process that we're going to use. We need a process, not an oracle. We shouldn't assume that there's an oracle. An oracle is a left-hand side concept. There are people on the left-hand side who can help us if that's the nature of the problem. There are people who have a pretty full understanding and can give us directions. That's not true in the environment that we're currently in. Okay, so what's the process? What I'm going to do is run very briefly through a set of things that we suggest are important elements of the process through which we're going to get better answers, through which we will learn as we go and improve our performance as we continue to try to understand this evolving situation or any such circumstance. What are the elements? Structure, people, a problem-solving process, the fact that we need to think of it as an experiment, that we are reasonable with our expectations about selves and others, and that we are careful in our communication. So I'm just going to say briefly a word about each of these, and we can follow up more in the questions. Let me actually stop here for a second, Jody. Are there other questions or other things that we should be picking up on in the chat before we move on to look at what this process actually is?
A lot of good comments, but no particular.
Wonderful comments.
Yeah.
This is great. Thank you guys for this. This is really, this is why I love chat, because chat is the thought bubble of this community that is formed around our mutual concerns about the situation we're all in. And it's lovely to see out loud people's thinking about that. So keep that going. Keep commenting. Keep thinking. Keep helping each other and me. All right, 6 elements: structure, people. All right, let's have a look at each of them. First, the structure. I don't care what you call it, but the important idea here is that you need a group. And I know we have a very wide range of different sizes of organizations. So if you're a small organization, this might just be you and a couple of people, or it might be you and some family and friends, or whatever is available to you. But the idea is we need a group which is responsible for wrapping its arms around the whole big picture for our organization. Here's the alternative. Often you see people say, well, we're going to have these people work on this aspect of it and those people work on that aspect of it. And that makes sense. You may want to differentiate, have different people working on different components. But the point is, somebody has to be responsible for looking across the whole and making sure that there isn't something that isn't being dealt with anywhere, because things often fall through the cracks. I've seen this happen in a lot of crisis situations where different offices were set up to work on different parts. So here's the food distribution area, this is the law enforcement area, and there were issues that should have been being addressed that each group thought somebody else was dealing with. So I need somebody, often called a critical incident management group or a senior strategic leadership group or a strategic policy committee, but some group that is overarching the whole thing. And what it does is it tries to understand as best it can what's going on. It tries to figure out what the important questions are, delegates some of that work, and then communicates to others about what's going on. Okay, second, who, what people? I want to suggest thinking about 3 different characteristics of people. The first is their knowledge of the organization, what we do, what we're trying to accomplish, and our basic capabilities and operating procedures, because those are still available to us, and we may need to modify them, but we need to know what they are. So we need people who have deep expertise in our organization and how it operates. Second, I need people who understand the external situation, who are able to look out and say, okay, well, things are changing out here. Now we're doing this, but we're not going to be able to do that for very long because there's going to be community spread within our community. So that they are monitoring the external situation and the relationship between that and what's going on with us. And then finally, I need people who are very clear about what our core values are. Core values are central to the ability to lead effectively in crisis circumstances, being very clear about what our core values are and what we're trying to achieve. And I tell people all the time, the one thing that you know for sure is what your core values are. You just need to remember them. That's often hard to do under stress. Other lesser important but more urgent things often intercede. So I hope these 3 groups will overlap for you, but we need at least to try to find people who can answer all 3 of these. That is not necessarily the same person, but a group of people who can understand what's going on in our business and how it operates, understand what the external situation is, and try to work the crosswalk between those 2 things. And then finally, who do that with an eye toward what we really care about most. This leads to the formation of, this is a team sport, not an individual sport. Even in small organizations, it should be a team sport because you need openness of thought. You need different people with different experiences and different expertise to help us do our very best in working through things. That core group that you're working with may be the same throughout, but the working groups should probably change. So I like to think of the team as being a dynamic concept here. The team is dynamic because the situation changes. Also because we learn more about it and realize here's something else that's really important. We need to pick up on this. So think about this as a team. At different times, we're going to draw people with different subject matter expertise in, and we're going to sometimes say, okay, we're done with that part now, but now we're moving on. The nature of the circumstance is different. Now we need people to help us figure out how we're reopening the schools rather than doing food distribution, because we've got the food distribution thing pretty well established. Okay, third element, and for me, this is really the heartbeat. Let me step out of the way of this again for a second and let you look at this list. This to me is the beating heart at the center of effective organizational adaptation to different circumstances. It flies under many flags. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. It's often called agile thinking or iterative problem solving. It begins, I've numbered it 0 because it's logically prior to everything else, not because I wrote the list and forgot and had to add one before it. Establishing your goals and values. This is back to this issue about priorities. Establish goals and values. Then what situational awareness means is try to understand the basic and most important elements of the situation that you're confronting. See if you can get at an ongoing basis. So situational awareness is changing because the event is changing and because we're learning about it. So try to understand what the circumstances are. Then figure out what are some different things we could do. Predict under each one of those. What do you think would happen? Choose the best one. It's called a course of action. Choose the best one that you're going to try it, and then repeat endlessly. And when I drew this arrow a little bit ambiguously, most of the time you loop back to the new situation, but sometimes you need to loop back and look at whether you got the goals and priorities and values right. So this is an iterative process. Now, you're probably familiar with this kind of scheme. You've probably seen it before in some form or other. We step back into this. So what do you call this process? It has many different names. Why do I emphasize this? This is a pretty pedantic version of it. There are many shorter versions that you've probably seen. They're 4 steps instead of, so this is often called, yes, isn't this a scrum? Yes, it's a scrum. This is also called, well, let me show you some of the other names are. It's often called the OODA loop, a term that came from military science, military decision-making process also. I call it the rational action model because I'm an economist by training, and that's what economists assumes, everybody's being rational. By the way, the other way you could describe this, it's just common sense. What else would you do? Of course you pay attention to your goals. Of course you look at what the situation is. Of course you have to think of different possibilities. What else would you do? And in fact, economists can show that this is the best problem-solving process. Any other problem-solving process is going to do at most as well as this one. This one will work better in most cases, but at least as well as anything else in any circumstance. There's a theorem about that in economics, but it's a very narrowly circumscribed idea. So I'm not pushing that, I'm just observing this is basic common sense. By the way, there's one other name that we could give it, which is that this is the case method. We as people who teach by the case method recognize this as the problem solving we're inducing people to do. Here's a bundle of facts. What are you going to do? What's your best approach or decision making? So I wanted to say one other thing about why I have 6 steps here, or 7 actually, which is that this may look like a pretty pedantic way to, often people will say like 2, 3, and 4 are analyze, or 2 and 3 are analyze and 4 is decide. So here's why, and you can, these slides will all be available to you. You can think through this at your leisure later, but just observe that each of these 6 things requires a different kind of work for people to do. The first, establish goals and values, is the work, by the way, in a religious community. This is part of the work of the teaching community, of the rabbis within your community, is to help think about how we clarify what our actual goals and values are. That's actually difficult to do. People are not always good at it, especially under stress. So that's a real thing. It's a real function, activity that we need to engage in. Situational awareness is descriptive. Creating options is creative, right? It's brainstorming. So that's a really different process than getting a description of what the current reality is. You don't want to mix those up. You want to make sure you have an idea of what the reality is before you begin brainstorming about what to do about it. Prediction of outcomes is really an analytical process. Choosing is an executive or an executive function. Execution is an administrative function. Okay, you got to send out the instructions. You got to help people understand what to do. Okay, I've probably spent enough time on this, but again, I think of this as the beating heart. And here's the sense in which I say that. I've been at many different significant emergency situations. And often, especially in the more dramatic, real crisis situations where it's very confusing, it's unfamiliar. The big question, again, what do we do when no one knows what to do? What I can tell you is people begin to feel better when they start doing this process. So you see people arrive and they say, well, let's do a kind of problem solving, let's just iterate through here a couple times and see what we can think of. And you can feel the cortisol levels go down in the group when that process begins, because it gives us a way of operating in a highly uncertain environment. But it's a systematic process that we can use, and it feels like we're going to make progress. And in fact, we do. So I urge this upon you as a basic idea for what you're trying to establish. Okay, I said 6. We've done 3, 1 a little bit more detail than the others. A point of this is when you choose a course of action and decide to move, this is what we're going to do. You need to remember that it's just the one you're going to try. It's only an experiment. So we should not make full-on commitments to a particular course of action. What we should say is, this is the thing that seems best to us as an approach right now. So we're going to try that and we're going to see how it goes. And we're going to treat it as something we're going to learn about rather than something that we are indelibly wedded to or welded to. So treat anything that we're doing as tentative. Remember, this is a learning process. We don't know all the answers yet. This is how we're finding out better answers. That's explicit in what we're trying to do. It's adaptive and learning oriented.
So how do you deal with the possibility that all the team members won't agree?
Often they won't agree. So actually, this is a very good question. This is actually, in general terms, in the problem solving, creative problem solving, in the midst of a circumstance like this, there's likely to be disagreement about what the situation is, about what the best course of action is for us to take. Most people will be able to agree that trying something is going to beat not trying something. And so in general, when we're having that brainstorming discussion, it's not a good time for a senior authority figure to be running the conversation, because that will tend to suppress the diversity and suppress the creativity in generating different options. So often I would urge you to have a facilitator. Again, this depends on the size of the enterprise and the size of the group you're working with. But often it's better if the person who is the ultimate decision maker, who has the authority to decide which course of action we're going to take, is not actually leading that conversation, but being advised by it. And then she or he can say, look, I know we don't all agree, but it's important that we try something. And this is what I've decided we're going to try. So please get behind that. Let's do our best. And I promise we're going to learn as fast as we can. And if this isn't working, we're going to try something else. So I think that's the spirit of how to deal with and treat diversity of thought and treat disagreement about the best direction as a normal circumstance in this kind of setting. It's not, and by the way, spending more time arguing about it till we all agree is not necessarily going to help us. So the idea is urge people to understand we are experimenting our way forward. So this isn't, once and for all, we're going this direction. It is, let's see how it goes. And if you're right and that isn't working, we'll reevaluate and we'll try something different.
And can you say,
sorry, go ahead, Jody.
No, can you say more about situational awareness and its ability to paralyze you if you don't set boundaries? Jody asks, is there such a thing as too much situational awareness?
So what is actually difficult, Jody, this is a great question, both Jodys. This is a great question. What is difficult about situational awareness in a true crisis situation is you don't even know what the list is of the most important things to notice. So think of a normal routine emergency situation, a house fire. Fire department shows up at a house fire. They know exactly what the things are that they need to know in order to operate as safely as possible. How many people are in the house? How big is the house? Are there any hazardous chemicals in the house? What's the basic design? Is there a chimney fire going, from the basement into the rest of the house? They know what the things are to pay attention to because they've been there 100 times, more than 100 times. They've been there thousands of times before, and they've accumulated experience about what are the key things to note. So the concept of situational awareness actually derives from flight safety. This is where this language originally developed. And if you ask pilots, what are the things that you need to know in order to know that you're operating okay and things are safe? All pilots everywhere in the world will give you roughly the same list of things to pay attention to. And it's not 600 things. It's more than 3 and it's less than 600. It tends to be a list of about 15 to 25 things, which if you understand these, that gives you a pretty good fix on what we're doing. But you know what that list is. So the pilot wants to know what's the engine speed, what's the state of our fuel, how much flying time do we have left, what's the weather outside, what's the terrain. There's a whole series of pretty obvious things, right? And all pilots will give you roughly the same answer. Okay, now we plunge you into COVID-19. What are the most important things to notice? We don't know enough about COVID-19 to even answer that question. To even know what are the 6, if we were trying to collect some data on what was happening, we wouldn't even know what the dimensions of that were. So that too, the understanding of what the list is of things that we need to know is something that is also evolving. As we went along, we discovered there were more things that we needed to know about COVID-19. As an example, we discovered that underlying conditions turned out to be really important. We didn't know that at the beginning. But we discovered that as we went along, and then we began paying attention. Okay, well, how many people in our community have underlying conditions, and what do we need to do about that to try to help them be as safe as they possibly can be? So situational awareness is a dynamic concept in a circumstance where we have an unknown situation, and we are learning about the nature of the situation while we are also trying to operate on it. This is the classic building the planes we're flying in. So can you have too much situational awareness? Yes, you can have a list of 600 things that you were pedantically trying to fill in, many of which are no longer relevant or never were relevant, or which are relatively minor. The challenge is to try to figure out what are the most important things that are happening, and as we discover new ones, to be able to keep up with that. It's a great question though, and if you get a really good answer to this question, please send it to me, because you're not the first to ask it. So I want to quickly finish up on this, and I want to come to your questions more generally, but quickly finish up on some of the elements of the basic process here. So I said, we've chosen a course of action, but it's tentative and experimental. So that means we need to have reasonable expectations. We need to be reasonable with ourselves and others about what we can't expect everything's going to work. What we can do is to say, we're going to learn, and we're going to figure out which things are working, and we're going to keep going with those, and we're going to scrap the ones that aren't, and we're going to find something better. And so that's the process and the spirit and the attitude, but that comes with not with reasonable expectations. Now, I spend time on that because if you think about what are the expectations in the left-hand side, if you have a left-hand side problem, the expectation is you will hit this target, and if you don't, something's wrong with you. That's not true here. We don't know how this is going to work. It's an experiment we're learning as we go along. Okay, final thing I wanted to spend a few minutes on is the idea of communication. Communicating about what is happening, about what the situation is, about what we are doing, and about what others should do is first order central to, absolutely essential to our making progress in the best way we possibly can. And I want to commend unto you something we call the Stockdale Principles. His name was given to it by Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. And so who's Admiral Stockdale? Admiral Stockdale was the senior American military officer in the prisoner of war camps in Vietnam. And as such, by the Geneva Convention, he was responsible for the welfare of all the other inmates, people like John McCain, for example. And he was widely credited by people who were in the camps with him, his subordinates, with saving many lives. Many people said that they would not have made it without things that he did that helped them. And so after the fact, he was asked, well, what did you do? How did you think about this? These are terrible circumstances. These people were being tortured. They were there for many, many years. I know this is an experience which calls up other historical memories for you. how do you make your way through these kinds of circumstances? And what Admiral Stockdale said, and this was called the Stockdale paradox. I prefer principles. The Stockdale paradox was, what Stockdale said is, in dire circumstances where people's lives are at risk and it's hard to see your way forward, you need to do two things. Leaders need to do two things. The first is you have to be brutally honest about what the actual circumstances are. You have to be honest about what's going on, because if you create a sort of fantasy sense of what's going on, false hopes, you sugarcoat the situation. If you do that, people will figure that out pretty fast, and then they will completely despair. And he said it was the false optimists who died first. That's, I think, an important idea. The people who were falsely optimistic, who were living in a fantasy world, were the people who became unnerved and they died in large numbers. So brutal honesty about the situation. But now here's the paradox. Let me step out so you can actually see the whole list here. The paradox is we need to find a rational basis for hope. So the leader both has to offer you a realistic understanding of the current situation, which may be horrible, but a rational basis for hope. What was the rational basis for hope? A rational basis for hope has to be things that we can actually control. So one of the things that he said was, I can't promise people that they're all going to survive. I can't promise them that they're all going to get home. And in fact, one of the false hopes is, well, they'll let us out by Christmas, because then Christmas comes and goes, or, whatever, by Rosh Hashanah, by the time that the new year changes, they'll be sending us home. Well, but when that comes and goes and it didn't happen, then they are in worse circumstances than ever before. So the honesty is, let's not put our hopes on things that we can't control. Well, what can they control? These are prisoners of war. They're literally being tortured. One of the things they can control is their own dignity. Another thing they can control is their own personal honor. And a third thing they can control is their allegiance to their country. And so they put their hope that they would be their best selves, that they would be able to withstand the pressures that they were put under, and that they would maintain their human dignity, they would retain their sacred honor, and that they would retain their allegiance to their country. And those who pledge themselves to, those are things, by the way, that you can control. And so that was a rational basis on which they could make their way forward. And the other thing, those are the two principles that Jim Collins talks about, that Admiral Stockdale talked about. By the way, this is very old advice. The advice that Stockdale was giving is very old advice in military circles. Napoleon, it goes at least as far back as Napoleon, probably farther. And the idea is be realistic, but find a basis on which you can be hopeful. We've added, as you see, the third principle, which is, I think, empathy is enormously important. And by this, I do not mean sympathy. Sympathy is also an important thing. But empathy is the ability to understand how things look to someone else as a result of their experience. And it's much harder than we give it credit for. I think most organizations think they're pretty empathic about the groups they work with. And we need to work much harder on this than we usually do. So I offer you these as three principles to guide your communication. You need to be honest about what the circumstances are, which means you need to be maintaining situational awareness. Back to the question Jody that we just talked about. Maintain situational awareness, be honest about that, but find a basis on which we can be hopeful about what's actually going on. I'm seeing wonderful observations in the chat. We're going to come back to this question about what the basis for hope is. So stay on that. Just a couple quick observations, and I want to turn to your questions. At best, on COVID, we are now in the muddled middle. We're experiencing a pretty significant surge. By the way, one of the things that haven't been pointed out very much in the news coverage about this is that when we first hit these numbers, 50, 60,000 cases a day in April, those cases were concentrated in a small number of places, and those places were completely overwhelmed, many of them. So we had tremendous challenges of trying to meet the demands for ICU beds and protection and so forth in a lot of, in those places where it was really intense. What we have now is a different phenomenon, highly predictable phenomenon, by the way, which is that this disease is now pretty well entrenched and established in every community. And so all communities are experiencing, almost all communities are experiencing an upswelling, particularly because people are tired of staying indoors, are tired of staying apart, tired of wearing masks. They want it all to be over. Well, it doesn't work like that. It's not about our preferences. And so predictably, as we go back indoors and we do some of these other interactions like schools, you would expect more spread, but it's now happening much more broadly. And I think we're unfortunately about to see a significant overload of service demands in many different places all at the same time, which is a very different phenomenon than what we were facing in April. In any case, there is much more still to do. Even if we had a vaccine, which we don't yet, even if we had a vaccine that we knew for sure was going to be highly reliable, it's a long time before that's going to have a big impact. We got a lot of months still to go, and those will be different from what we've seen before. So there's ongoing, it's not like, okay, now we all get it, we know understand this. There's much more still to be determined. So going forward, we have the same problem that we've had for 7 months. What do we do when still no one knows what to do? And the answer to that is we have to keep figuring it out in real time under stress. The challenges are we don't fully understand the situation as it is. The situation keeps changing. And the response that we and others are giving is also changing the external environment for us. The way others are responding, for example, choosing to send kids back to school, is changing the threat level for other people in the community. The rest of us have to deal with that fact as well. So here we are, folks, still in the upper right-hand side for months yet to come. So an implication of that is don't give quick answers. Remember that the answer to every COVID-19 question is a process. And what we are doing is to stay in that upper right-hand side. The term for this, I use the term exploit for the lower left-hand side. The term for the upper right-hand side is often called explore. This is from a paper by Jim March in the early 90s. The idea of explore is I am finding new things. I'm inventing or discovering, I'm experimenting. In other words, what we have to do is continue to innovate. So what you see, I think, in this discussion, and why I want to tie back to the beginning of it, to me, crisis leadership is just an instance of innovation. Innovation on steroids, under stress, embedded in fear. So that's actually what makes it interesting. So I actually came to thinking about and working on crisis management because it was a way of understanding management and leadership better. I was not interested in it per se, but rather as a way of illuminating lessons in leadership. But then over time, I became more fascinated by it. And I have to say, the downside of my profession is it's not fun to be looking at situations that are horrible situations, but it's incredibly informative and interesting and positive in the sense that we can do better. And that is what I have to keep as a positive attitude about working on this, because you do have to look at pretty horrible circumstances. So my admonition for you is that the leadership skills that we've all been developing and using for these many months are going to continue to be useful for a very long time. So make note of them. I hope going through what I just did and telling you how we label and name some of these things helps you to organize some of your thinking about the specifics of what you've been doing. But my point to you is you've been speaking prose all of your life. You have been practicing crisis management throughout, and the basic things that I was talking about throughout the COVID experience. I hope you're better. One of the things, by the way, I've talked to literally tens of thousands of people about this over the last 8 months. I've talked to many, many hundreds of different organizations. Almost universally, they say the same thing to me, which is they turned out to be much more adaptive and capable of doing this than they ever realized that they could be, that they would have predicted. And they say, and we're not going back. We are going to maintain this kind of more open, innovative, change-oriented kind of attitude, which I think is a small but really important silver lining to this terrible dark cloud that we've been living through. Let me stop here and see if there are questions, comments, observations, anything else you'd like to direct my attention to. I can see lots of questions here. Jody, help me out. Where should we go? By the way, Andy, Dr. Amy Acton is awesome. And in fact, I think it is a non-random fact that if you look at places where we had early effective action, in many of these circumstances, you find the leadership of a woman standing behind that. That is true in New Zealand. It's Jacinda Ardern. It's true in San Francisco. It's the mayor of San Francisco. It's the woman who's the head of the Santa Clara County Health Service. It's Amy Acton in Ohio. It's an amazing set of people.
What do all those things have in common?
Well, all of those places all of those places are places where early action was taken that mattered. And what they have in common is that it was a woman driving it in every one of those cases.
Strange.
Mayor London Breed in San Francisco. I'm blocking the name of the woman who runs the Santa Clara Health Department. But Santa Clara, my daughter's a medical student at Stanford at the moment, and so she was actually at Santa Clara Hospital when this happened. And it was the county director. That was the first epicenter in California, and it was the Santa Clara County Health Officer who mobilized the rest of the San Francisco region, and then in the person of London Breed, the Mayor London Breed, that they actually took action 2 weeks ahead of other places in the country.
Yeah, I just think
Cody, thank you. Yes, thank you, Lael. Thank you.
that women have been so effective here. I mean, it's just interesting, but
so maybe it's that they have their priorities right. I don't want to speculate, but I will. But it's an important empirical observation.
Yeah.
Jacinda Ardern has just been swept to an amazing victory as the next as continuing prime minister in New Zealand because of and if you are interested in a lesson on leadership, go back and look at her commentary about two events. One was the attacks at the mosque in Christchurch, two mosques actually in Christchurch. Her response to that was awe-inspiring. In her ability, go back and look at the Stockdale principles and look at how she operated. And then similarly, her response in dealing with COVID. It's really quite a profound lesson for how leadership can be most effective. But Jody, what else? What other questions? What else do we need to?
Rabbi Chase asks, states really on a deep level, what you have to figure out why all this is happening. Do you feel your strategies address an understanding of what is happening? Is this demanding us to stop leading with our ego-logical mind and to lead with our intuition, our right brain?
This is a lovely question. Yes. Well, first of all, I hope it won't be lost on you if you go back and look at that chart. Left-hand side, right-hand side does line up with sides of the brain. The left-hand side's all about analytics and precision. Oh, by the way, I said before that I referred to the left-hand side as perfectly exactly correct. And I said there was a title of a book. The title of the book is about the right-hand side. And this is the aspiration for you in crisis and for other situations of innovation. The title of the book, most of the value of this book, I'm afraid, is in the title. It's actually a really interesting book, and if you look it up, the author's name is Leslie Valiant, and it's about algorithms and evolution. It's got a lot of really fascinating stuff. And Rabbi, I am going to come back to your question. But the title of the book is Probably Approximately Correct. This is a good way to state what the aspiration is in crisis management. If we can get it probably approximately correct, we've done well. Okay, that's the idea, that this is experimental and learning and so on. Now, the question I think you're asking, Rabbi, is a question about how we focus on what the goals are, how we make sure that we are understanding, when we say why this is happening to us, what kind of explanation would we give to that? We might understand that some of this is happening to us because we haven't always been our best selves. We haven't always been our best selves at being willing to look at what's really going on around us and deal with it. We have preferred to assert things rather than to actually learn things. To me, that sort of approach is not helpful. And so I think this is a circumstance where trying to understand to the best we can what the data tell us about what we should be doing and how to operate seems like the right strategy. And to me, the incredible tragedy of COVID-19, not principally here, more here than elsewhere, but in some other places as well, the terrible tragedy is we had the tools in our hands. All it took was for us to engage in a distinctly different set of behaviors. And in fact, if we had done that more assiduously earlier, we could have saved both more lives and also much more of the economy. So we squandered the economy and literally tens of thousands of lives by not being willing to face the new uncomfortable reality and figure out all the tools that we have so far, almost all are in our own individual hands. Do you wear a mask? Do you maintain social distancing? Do you wash your hands? That's the main thing that we needed. And as Rabbi Moses said at the outset, that was what people had available to them in 1918. And the communities that did that survived the 1918 flu, and the communities that didn't bother had a horrible circumstance. So now we have other tools that are coming, therapeutics, eventually we'll have a vaccine, but the tools we had from the very beginning, and it was understood. You could see this in China. You could see what was happening in China. The way they applied social distancing, mask wearing, et cetera, actually got the epidemic, which had begun and was horrible, and basically began because they, first of all, it was hard to understand, which it always is when something's new. But then they also chose to try to suppress it, which was a huge mistake on their part, suppress the news about it, which allowed it to get more established. But as soon as they really got on top of it, it began to come under control. So we've had the behavioral tools available to us from the beginning. All right, you hear my frustration about this. Let's go back to some other questions.
So there's a question about leaders and what skills are needed besides open-mindedness. So what other characteristics have you identified to point to successful leaders during a crisis?
So this is a really good question because it goes to the issue of what's different between people who are good managers and people who are effective leaders. And the differentiation I'm making here, I mean, first of all, I think we've done a world of hurt to ourselves by saying we're not going to have management anymore. Everybody's going to be a leader. You know, we're only going to emphasize leadership. That puts aside something which is a hugely important human activity, which is management. Precise, effective execution, which is what management's about, is really valuable, right? It dramatically reduces costs, increases productivity. It's a wonderful thing. The point is not that it's bad. The point is it's not everything. There is a set of problems for which we need to have leadership. And so what are the different characteristics of leadership? Well, first of all, one I would point to is humility. It's the fact that, so think about the left-hand side mentality. The left-hand side mentality turns to authorities, and this is a deliberately gender-laden term. I call this the daddy model of leadership. The daddy model is daddy will know. Let's just ask daddy and we'll follow what he says. And we turn expectantly, our hopes high to whatever our authority figure is. That works on the left-hand side because we have experts. We have people who can actually answer. And whether it's a she or a he, they have the expertise and they can tell us. On the right-hand side, nobody is an expert, but we often behave as if we were because the sociology induces that. People turn expectantly to you and say, okay, what are we going to do here? And you want to be able to say, because our ideas that we have in mind of what good leadership looks like is that it's actually, there was a federal agency, I won't tell you which one, they've now changed this. There was a federal agency, law enforcement agency, whose motto was, the effective law enforcement official is prompt and decisive. Prompt and decisive. Think about that. In other words, quick decisions and go with it, right? There are many circumstances in which that's really valuable. But in circumstances where you don't know what's going on, it's not. It's better to take some time and think about it. And they changed their attitude. They changed this motto after being in some events where stopping and thinking about it for a while would have been a lot better outcome. So I think the point here is we want to differentiate. I think the easiest way to think about what are good leadership behaviors is to differentiate leadership and management. There's a whole series of clarifying, decisive, prompt, expertise-driven ideas about management. On leadership, I want humility. I don't know the answer. Nobody else knows the answer either. I want a learning orientation. So I want somebody who believes in the value of that iterative problem-solving process. Over and over again, we're going to learn. What else do you have to do to make sure that learning process is going to work? You need a diverse group. If you get me 20 copies of the same person in the room, and we're all thinking about this question in the same way, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is we're going to all agree that we're all brilliant because we all had the same idea. And we're going to be vastly overconfident that that's the right idea to pursue. So what I want is a group of different people in the room So diversity is essential, and that means that conflict of ideas is the expected circumstance. So I need a leader who can, A, understand that that's the case, B, live in an environment where there's a lot of ambiguity about it, and not cut to the chase too quickly. So again, that's part of the reason I argue for having a facilitator and having the leader, the final decision maker, be advised rather than playing an active part in the process. Because when the person who's going to decide is involved in the conversation, what tends to happen, and we see this empirically, and it also shows up in lab experiments, what tends to happen is people pretty quickly begin to focus on what they think the leader wants as the answer. And the bandwidth in the organization shrinks dramatically as that happens, way too soon. So leadership to me is I suggest that leadership is the process of operating those 6 steps that I argued to you at the outset in the discussion. They're embedded in the slides. Sorry, I'm giving long answers to great questions, but you get me started on some of my favorite subjects.
A lot of good questions. One asks, there's a lot of focus on time. One set of questions are asking, how much does this process take? Because we're in emergency. And the second set of questions is, gee, we're used to planning for a campaign year or a fiscal year, not, little bits of increments. And how do we deal with that?
These questions are too hard, Jody. Can you give me some other questions instead?
How are you feeling today?
So this is really a wonderful, again, it comes back to our distinction between management and leadership. On a managerial problem, on a left-hand side problem, on which we have a high degree of expertise, you should expect a prompt answer. You should expect us to be able to decide immediately. And so this leads to a kind of thinking, which is what really effective people can do, and I'm looking for someone in a crisis who can give quick answers, who's prepared to be decisive and confident. I think that's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake because that person doesn't know any better than anybody else if they're in a situation that we haven't been in before. And it is not true that trying anything beats not trying anything. Sometimes it's better to wait. So I think it's a really important, and it's a difficult decision. How long do we wait? But the advice would be, if we really are in a situation that we don't understand, there may be some things that we have to respond to immediately anyway, because they're so urgent, life safety, we have to try to get these people out of harm's way. And even though we don't understand everything, we're going to do whatever we can. But unless it's something like that, it may make sense to slow down and think more. Daniel Kahneman calls this system 2 thinking, or the second process of thinking. The first is the kind of instant reaction. That's more of the managerial left-hand side circumstance. And the alternative process, slow thinking, is go through those 6 steps, 7 steps, because we repeat is one of them, and 0 is one of them is numbered 0. Go through those steps and do that again and again and again. Now, here's the problem of managing that in timing. This is why it's an important characteristic for a leader. The group would prefer, this is a bias, the group would prefer to imagine that we are on the left-hand side and that you as the leader are supposed to know the answer. And they would be more comfortable if you would just say, not to worry, folks, I understand what's going on here. This is what we're going to do. That will raise their comfort level. The problem is, it's also likely to get us a bad answer, because you don't know better than anybody else if we're in a situation that's entirely new. So one of the hardest things for leaders to do is to say, I don't know. We don't know. We are going to have to find out. And here is how we are going to find out. I don't know what the answer is, but I can tell you what the process is. So the argument is that leaders should be quite decisive about process, but not about what the answers are going to be. That's I think, a fundamental characteristic of leaders. Well, let me say one other thing. It came up in one of the earlier questions, but it's related. One of the other things that leaders need to do, if you're going to run that kind of diverse, open, creative problem-solving process, it needs to be diverse. You need to have you need to have multiple different perspectives in it, because if we don't know the answer, we don't know who's going to come up with the answer or components of the answer that we're going to put together, that we have to assemble and integrate. So 2 things about that. First is, we want to keep people in a mode which is largely inquiry, not advocacy. We don't want to invite people in that problem-solving group to advocate for their idea, because then they try to smash other people's ideas. They try to hide what's wrong with theirs. They're trying to advance their idea at the expense of others. What we want is, this is an integrative process. We want people to be inquiring, to ask, would this help? And I've got this idea, but it's got a problem. Does anybody see any way we could mitigate that problem and still be able to use this idea? So you see, the process of inquiry is fundamentally different. And here's the challenge. When someone begins advocating, that tends to escalate. Others start advocating as well. And so a really important aspect of facilitation and leadership in this kind of circumstance is helping people to stay in inquiry mode rather than having the conditions decline into advocacy. So that's actually a really important, and it's a part of a more general issue that I want to frame for you as leaders of this kind of problem-solving process, and that is the idea of psychological safety. I think this term was coined by my colleague, Amy Edmondson. In any case, she's done a lot of work on this at the business school. The idea of psychological safety is that people need to feel safe doing what you need them to do. They need to feel safe in inquiry mode. They need to feel safe bringing forward ideas. If they get smashed, for both of their first two suggestions, you can be sure you're not going to hear many more suggestions from them. So creating the conditions, and this is I think, perhaps the best answer I can give you to the question about leadership. Leadership is not something that you are. It's not a position that you're in. It's not a power that you have. It's not a belief. It's not an emotion. Leadership is a set of things that you do. And what I think leaders do when they're being most effective is to create conditions that match the task environment. They create conditions for the group that helps the group to grapple with the actual situation that it has. So if I understand the task environment, we spent a lot of time here talking about the task environment for the right-hand side. Lots of uncertain things, not sure which the best approach is, need a lot of different ideas. So the leaders need to set conditions for effective problem solving by the group, understanding that that's the environment. Managers also, by the way, set conditions for people to succeed on the left-hand side. So I think this is a phrase that comes to me from a colleague of ours, unfortunately no longer with us. His name was Richard Hackman, who is taught in the psychology department and at Harvard Business School. He wrote a book called Great Performances. And what he said was, great performances cannot be engineered. You can't just have a handle cranking mechanism. That's a left-hand side idea. Great performances, he said, only emerge from conditions. So what you can do is create conditions out of which a great performance will emerge. So this is my aspiration for you as leaders, that you will create the conditions in your organization out of which great solutions to the ongoing challenges of COVID-19 will emerge. That's the idea of probably approximately correct. That's the right aspiration and the right goal. I keep droning on here, Jody. You need to stop me and help me come back to these issues about that you're raising in the questions.
Sure. So there's a great question from Sasha about, can we think of diversity as the middle or even right-hand side of the graph? And can thinking about diversity in this way help get leadership on board with a more diverse team?
Oh, this is a wonderful question. I actually think diversity is a useful resource in any part of the spectrum, but it's an especially useful resource on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we all pretty much know what we're supposed to be doing, and doing it all the same way is a way we make it more efficient. So diversity still is helpful because we may have some incremental innovation to do. We may need some ideas there as well. But the farther you get over to the right, the more creativity you need, the higher is the degree of importance attached to diversity. So again, let me just say one word about what I mean here, because I think the language is interesting. The way in which our language around diversity has evolved. So remember, we used to call it diversity. We needed more diversity in our organizations. And so we went out and we got more people who were different from the people who were originally there. Notice, that was us doing something to them, bringing them into our organization. So here they were. So we are now diverse. We are proud of this because we have different people. That actually didn't accomplish very much because most of those people didn't really feel included. So then there was the move for diversity and inclusion. We're going to include these people. They're actually going to have their different ideas are going to come forward and they're going to be included. Notice both diversity and inclusion were things we did, the organization did, to the people who were diverse. First, it brought them there, then it included them. In effect, we allowed them to be part of the group. So that didn't seem quite enough. So then we changed the language again, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Okay, because belonging is something that I'm doing. I feel like I belong here. So when I'm included and I feel belonging, then I'm really participating. That's sure enough a pretty important improvement. I want to go one further. Diversity, inclusion, belonging, and ownership. I want people, a diverse collection of people, to feel ownership, an equity stake in what's going on, that they own it in the same way that everybody else in the organization owns it. Well, you know, we have different stakes and some people have more authority, but the point is we all feel like we have an equity position in this. We have an equity stake in the outcomes. We have an equity stake in the process, in the decision-making process. If we can get to there, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and ownership, we will have reinvented fire. And that's my admonition. And that's part of what I mean by the conditions that we need to create as leaders in the organization so that that's actually what's happening. This is really fun. You guys are asking great questions. I appreciate being turned loose on some of my favorite subjects. I hope it's helpful to you all. I know we only have a few minutes left. So Jody, maybe you have one or two more questions. Yeah, I could go on and on. I'm afraid I might.
JC asks how you develop all this organizational discipline in your culture prior to an emergency, because developing it in the midst of battle is obviously more complex.
You guys are singing my song. I love this. How do you do that? That's a great question. I'm going to answer this one. I'm going to say a couple other words about just to close us out here. But I think the essence of our courses on crisis management has been trying to convince people that there might come a day. So of course you want to be organized for all the routine things and you want to build the routine apparatus, but you also want to be organized for the possibility that something might come over the transom that's completely different from what you've seen before. So you should have built that apparatus ahead of time. I think COVID-19, a silver lining for us about this terrible dark cloud is that I don't think anybody's ever going to be confused about that again. I think people in our classes will recognize that they need this kind of apparatus. But you are so right that in the midst of the crisis is not the best time to be trying to figure out what that structure is, how you're going to bring these people together. Now, we've all been forced to do that. But if you can, I would say maintain that as a critical organizational characteristic and capability. That process of innovation and brainstorming and you know, we ought to do projects even after COVID. You know, there's lots of more change that's going to happen in the world. So absolutely, yes, it's not something we only need in crisis circumstances. It's something we need a continuous process of scanning for innovation opportunities and possibilities. And we're going to see a lot more of that in the future time and place. So let me now just take a couple minutes and offer a few final thoughts about how you might think about this. First of all, COVID is clearly a watershed disruption, and permanent changes happen, often unpredictable ones. So if you look at World War II, it changed a lot of things, but they didn't mostly have to do directly with the war. It's just that there was so much disruption that a lot of other things got changed instead. COVID-19 is going to accelerate a bunch of trends that already existed. Think about, for example, telecommuting or business travel. The permanent changes are going to happen in these things. But that results in enormous opportunities. There are whole new sets of capabilities that we have, whole new sets of problems that we're going to see, and challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. That's what leadership can help us to spot and can move us toward. So I spoke earlier about this question about the rational basis for hope. And I want to tell you what my rational basis for hope is. My rational basis for hope is all the many voices that showed up in this chat and in these questions, and all the voices that didn't, but all the people that were here today and thinking about these issues. My rational basis for hope is the resilience and the adaptability and the learning process that you all bring to your organizations. That's what's going to get us through this, and it's what's going to continue to help us to build a brighter future in the Jewish community and around the world in everything that we do. systematically, we underpredict how much capacity we have for change and adaptation. And so I urge you to look at what you've been doing over the last 8 months and realize what it tells you about how adaptive and how creative we can actually be. Admonition to you, do take care of yourself. Self-care is something everybody says, oh, we understand we need to do that. Nobody does enough of this. So find some sanctuaries, find some ways of being not in the thing the whole time, take some rest, save yourself. We got a long way to go. You know, we've been talking about this as a marathon. A lot of people, unfortunately, have only trained for a half marathon. So keep at that. I urge you to think this is something that has to be done. We have to continue to help our organizations and our world through this. I hope this is going to be the hardest thing that any of you has ever asked to do, the most disruptive, most difficult circumstance that we face. I hope that's the case. I believe strongly that with effective leadership, you can do this in your life, in your organization, in your community. And in a way, only you all can do it. We need distributed leadership. So I'm going to close by observing that there's a song that Joan Baez wrote. Actually, she didn't write it, but she sang it. That was actually about this event. See if you don't think that this song is about this event. I don't know if Zoom's actually going to carry this, but I hope you'll get the basic idea. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, gonna build a brand new world. Ain't gonna let that COVID disruption turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let that COVID disruption turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, gonna build a brand new world. Go forth from this place in time. It's been my huge privilege to be with you. Thank you so much. And
Thank
all
you
best
so,
wishes to you in all
so
that you
much,
do.
Professor Leonard. Thank you to Rabbi J. Moses, and thank you to everyone who chatted in or asked a question. It was your participation that made it really special. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. See you at the plenary at 1:30.
Huge privilege to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Great fun.
That was amazing. You pulled out that surprise ending for whoever stuck around for the credits. Oh my God.
Yeah, don't put that up in the tape. It's not good enough to, but it's sort of fun as a surprise once in a while. Hey, Jay, I just want to say thank you for making this connection.
Before you keep going, hold on, let me stop the recording and then you guys can go.
No, it's all right. This is all fine as part of the recording. Hey, Jay, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. It was really fun. And
thank you for doing it.
Well, I hope it's helpful to folks. I'm happy to volunteer to help you guys. I wish you all the best with the General Assembly and everything else.
Thank you so much, Dutch. Really,
pleasure.
Really, we'll be in touch.
All right, onward. Yep, we'll look forward. All right,
Professor Leonard, if I may ask you a question, how do you manage to put the slides as part of your background constantly changing?
Oh yeah, so that's a challenge.